The Middle Kingdom of Egypt, c. 225-1650 BCE, marked a period of political stability and cultural renaissance after the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. It was a time of consolidation and expansion for Egypt, both in terms of territory and cultural influence. However, this era also saw the arrival of a significant group of immigrants, most notably the Canaanites and other Asiatic peoples. Their migration to Egypt, largely driven by economic opportunities and regional instabilities, led to cultural and social tensions, especially as these immigrants began to settle and integrate into Egyptian society. The migration of Asiatic peoples into Egypt during the Middle Kingdom was not a singular event, but part of a broader pattern of movement across the ancient Near East. This period, particularly during the reign of Amenemhat II, c. 1929-895 BCE, saw increased migration due to the weakening of surrounding regions like Canaan and the Levant. These areas were suffering from drought, famine, and the constant warfare among local powers, prompting many to seek better opportunities in Egypt, which was thriving under the Middle Kingdom's relative prosperity. The Canaanites, who were among the most prominent of these Asiatic immigrants, had long interacted with Egypt, both as trading partners and as occasional adversaries. They were familiar with Egyptian culture, religion, and politics. However, their arrival in significant numbers presented challenges. The Canaanites were often seen by Egyptians as foreigners or Asiatics, a term that carried negative connotations of instability and unpredictability despite their shared history of interaction. This created a source of friction between the Egyptians and the immigrants, especially in urban areas and newly founded settlements. The cultural differences between the Egyptians and these immigrants were marked. While both cultures practiced polytheism, their religious systems and deities were different, and the Asiatics brought with them their own set of customs, language, and art forms. These cultural distinctions contributed to the perception that the immigrants were other, making their integration into Egyptian society difficult. The Egyptians were highly protective of their cultural identity, and any foreign influence was often viewed with suspicion. In this context, the settlement of Canaanites in Egypt led to a rise in cultural anxiety, as they represented both a new labor force and a potential threat to the existing order. The economic integration of the Canaanites into Egyptian society also contributed to the tensions. Many of the immigrants, especially the Canaanites, were skilled artisans, traders, and laborers who had experience in managing agriculture and trade in the Levant. They brought new techniques, such as the use of wheeled vehicles, which they had developed in the Levant, and their participation in the Egyptian economy became essential to the prosperity of the Middle Kingdom. However, their presence was not always welcomed by the native Egyptians, who viewed these new techniques and methods with a degree of mistrust. In particular, the increase in the Asiatic labor force led to concerns among the Egyptian elite that the newcomers might take over key economic sectors, threatening the social order. Politically, the settlement of the Canaanites and other Asiatic peoples was intertwined with Egypt's expanding influence over the Levant and Sinai. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs sought to control trade routes and establish military presence in the Sinai and Canaan, often through diplomacy and the settlement of foreign populations. Some of these immigrants, particularly Canaanite rulers and their followers, were given land and allowed to manage strategic regions, acting as intermediaries between Egypt and the Levant. This arrangement helped to solidify Egypt's control over the eastern Mediterranean, but it also exacerbated the friction between the native Egyptian populace and the immigrants, as the Canaanites were seen as collaborators with foreign powers. Socially, the presence of the Canaanites and other Asiatics in Egypt had complex implications. On the one hand, the Egyptians were highly stratified, with a rigid class system that was often based on ethnic origin. The foreign immigrants, particularly the Canaanites, occupied a lower social status compared to native Egyptians, although some of them were able to rise in social rank, depending on their skills and connections. The more affluent Canaanites often integrated into Egyptian society through intermarriage, and some became part of the elite circles. Yet these intermarriages, while promoting cultural exchange, also created tension, as many Egyptians viewed these unions as a form of cultural dilution. Religious tensions also played a role in the social frictions between the Egyptians and the Canaanites. While both groups worshipped multiple gods, their pantheons were distinct, and the Egyptians were often suspicious of foreign religious practices. Over time, some Egyptian deities became associated with the foreigners' beliefs, and certain Canaanite religious symbols were adopted by the Egyptians. However, these syncretic practices were often viewed with wariness, as the Egyptians feared the dilution of their religious purity. The clash of religious systems, alongside the cultural differences, compounded the social discord between the two groups. The Egyptians also viewed the Canaanites' customs, particularly their language and ways of dress, as a sign of their otherness. Canaanite clothing, which was often simpler and more practical than the fine linen garments worn by Egyptians, was seen as a marker of their foreign status. Likewise, the Canaanite language, which was Semitic in origin, was seen as incomprehensible and barbaric to the Egyptians, who spoke a language with a very different structure. This linguistic divide further isolated the two groups, making communication and integration difficult. Despite these social frictions, the Canaanites and other Asiatic immigrants played a crucial role in the development of the Middle Kingdom's economy and military. Their skills and knowledge contributed to Egypt's flourishing trade networks, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their ability to navigate the complexities of trade with the Levant helped Egypt maintain its dominance in the region. In return, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom often rewarded their Asiatic subjects with land, wealth, and positions of power, though this sometimes fueled resentment among the native Egyptian population. The tensions between the native Egyptians and the Asiatic immigrants came to a head in the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1000 BCE, when the Hyksos, a group of Asiatic peoples, including Canaanites, took control of the northern part of Egypt. The Hyksos ruled for several centuries and further entrenched the idea of foreign rule, which would have lasting consequences for Egypt's relationship with the Asiatics. The memory of this period, coupled with the earlier cultural and social frictions, likely contributed to the rise of nationalist sentiments in later Egyptian history. In conclusion, the arrival of Canaanite and other Asiatic immigrants in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom led to significant cultural and social frictions. While these immigrants contributed to the economic and military success of Egypt, their integration into society was fraught with tension. Cultural differences, economic competition, and political instability led to a complex relationship between the native Egyptians and the immigrant groups, one that would have lasting repercussions for the future of Egypt.